The kick and the bass are the foundation of any electronic dance music track, and if you get them wrong, it could ruin an otherwise decent track. Today I want to show you how to pick or create the perfect kick drum that's going to work well with every track you produce. What are the different parts of a kick drum? How do you choose what's going to work for your genre? Should you tune that kick drum? I've got something to say about that, deadmau5. And how should you process it? All of these will be answered today. But firstly, I want to give you an example of the difference that a decent kick drum can make. So here's a track that's got the wrong kick drum. And here's another example. I've heard so many tracks that could have been fixed just by switching out the kick drum. It's that important. Now before we start, I want a quick shout out to my accelerator students who have achieved some incredible things this year, including getting signed to some of the world's biggest labels and accruing millions of streams across Spotify and chart positions in Beatport. Excellent work guys, you put in the hard work and now you're getting the results. Okay, let's pick that perfect kick drum. Now I respect your time, so for speed, I've put together my 10 most used kick drums in a free sample pack that you can download below this video, which is going to save you a bunch of time, but you still need to know which one is going to work for which track. Which leads me to point number one. There's actually no such thing as a perfect kick drum any more than there is such a thing as a perfect partner in life. Apart from my wife, of course. There are simply important characteristics that either complement or clash with the characteristics of the other elements in your track. It's kind of like wine pairing. Some wines work really well with foods and some wines don't. For example, if I was to have a Malbec on my cornflakes first thing in the morning, that would be disgusting. But if I was to have a Malbec with my fillet steak first thing in the morning, that would be an amazing way to start every day. Disclaimer, drinking wine is not the perfect way to start a day. It's whiskey. With that being said, there are certain steps you can take to picking the most appropriate kick for your track. But before we look at those steps, it's important to understand what a kick drum actually is. So let's break down the three constituent parts of every kick drum. So here I've got three examples of three different kick drums, and they're all made of these three different parts, which is the transient, which is the initial high-end, usually a click or a tick type sound. Then you've got the main body of the kick, which imparts its character and timbre. And then you've got the tail of the kick, which is the way it decays out. And that's usually the sub-frequencies, which give the kick its fundamental frequency or pitch. So let's have a listen to these three kicks and have a look at the spectrum analyzer as well and see what's going on. So our first kick sounds like this. We can see our fundamental frequency here is the biggest frequency, and that's hitting at about G at the moment, G0. So let's have a listen to each of these parts. First, we're going to turn off the body and the tail and just listen to the transient. And you can hear it's just this high-end tick sound. Now let's listen to the body, and that's this, which is more of the mid-range, because a kick drum kind of goes from a high frequency down to a low frequency. And if you use Kick 2, which is a synth for creating kicks, you'll actually see that in action. And then we're going to listen to the tail, which is the kind of subby thump, which we can see here is giving it that G0. So now let's have a quick look at the other two kicks we've got, just to see if the theory holds true for different types of kick. So this is the full kick all at once. So there's a really prominent transient there. Let's just listen to that on its own. Just that little clicky tick. Then we've got the body, which is kind of sounding like an acoustic kick drum almost. And then that subby rumble once again, which is giving it that fundamental frequency. Then let's listen to the third kick. Same situation. And this is more of a melodic house kick, so it's a bit more subdued, but it's still got this quite ticky transient at the beginning. Then we've got the body, which is the main character, which gives it that feeling of an acoustic kick drum, and then the tail, which is the sub-frequency, and you can see here it's hitting at about F. Okay, so that's all very well and good. Now we know what different parts make up a kick drum, but the important thing is how you can pick the right kick for your track, and it's all to do with track hierarchy. So let me explain. If you start off your track with a bass sound, then you have to pick a kick that is going to work with that bass sound. Conversely, if you start your track with a kick drum, you then have to pick a bass sound that's going to work with that kick drum. And if you start your track with any other element like vocals, synths, or whatever, you'll still have to pick either the kick before the bass or the bass before the kick. So my point still stands. Now, the bass of a track will usually impart more character than the kick drum. And for that reason, I would say selecting your bass first is more important than the kick, because you can always find a kick to work with that bass. And if you want me to make a video covering how to select the perfect bass for your track, let me know in the comments below this video. Is that something that you'd be interested to learn? Bass is boss. So the question then becomes, which kind of kick is going to work with the bass that you already have? Well, I've tried very hard to devise methods by which you can organize your kick drums by genre, but it doesn't always work because you can use multiple kick drums across multiple genres. Although there are admittedly a couple of rules of thumb, such as tech house will usually have a 909 kick, trap will often have an 808 kick, which often doubles as the bass line, techno will sometimes have a distorted kick, and trance almost always has a really punchy and powerful kick. But as I said, this is just a rule of thumb, so it's always better to match your kick perfectly to the specific track you're working on. So here are the steps I go through to pick the perfect kick drum. And yes, it's true that you can layer several kick drums to create the perfect kick drum, but the longer I do this, and it's been quite a long time now, the more I realize it's way better to just spend an extra 10 minutes picking a kick drum that works really well with your track, rather than trying to shoehorn together several different kick drums and try and make it work. So here's how to do it. Now the first thing I do is program in the kick in MIDI. You can use audio instead of MIDI, but I like MIDI for a couple of reasons that will become apparent shortly. One is that you can really quickly hot swap out those samples, but you can also change the pitch of the kick, which we'll be touching upon soon, very, very quickly. So that's how kick pattern programmed in, nice and easy. Now right off the bat, I'm going to say that you should always be aware of the length of your kick and actually dial in the length before you even start choosing the kick. So there's a couple of ways you can do it. If you're using an audio kick, you can just trim the clip, but if you're using MIDI from a sampler, as I am in this example, you can set your release to be quite short and just make sure that your sustain is on full. And then you don't want your kicks lasting more than half a beat in length. And that's because it's probably going to fight with your bass line. Now, if you put the release too short, you sometimes might get a click. So that's why I have that release at about 100 milliseconds. Now, the other option is to leave that at default, or either make sure that your kicks last a whole beat each, and then to use either LFO tool or Shaperbox to shape the length of that kick. So I'm just going to load in Shaperbox after the kick, and let's see what's going on. Well, we need to set the time to be 1/4, and that means that the Shaperbox will cycle through its LFO sequence once on every beat. So you can see our kick drum's playing there. Now this is quite a short kick drum anyway. Next thing I would do is set it up so you don't have more than that half a beat playing. And that's just to rein in any of the tail. Now quite often with a kick drum, you'll probably want even half of this length, so 1/4 of one beat instead of half of one beat. And having the Shaperbox just allows you to really carefully craft that shape to be exactly as you want. But that comes a bit later, so for selecting the kick, I recommend just putting it at about that, so it's about half a beat long, and then we can get onto the next stage. Okay, next thing I do is make sure that I have a mono switch on my master channel, and that's because we don't want our ears to be deceived and tricked by the stereo field. So if we turn on our bass line, you can hear there's a lot going on in the stereo field. So I'm just going to switch the whole mix to mono. And now I can really focus on how the kick is working with the frequencies in the bass line. Next, I'm going to set my kick to peak a bit lower than I would usually, a couple of dBs lower. So that would probably be a bit quiet in the mix. And the reason I want to do this is because when I'm selecting through the kicks, I want to find one that really pops and shines and fits well with the bass, of course, without having to be super loud. Because if you've got this kick set quite loud, the chances are you might think several different kicks work well, but it's really just because they're too loud. That's why I'm taking it down lower than it's going to be finally. So if it sounds good at too low a volume, it's really going to sound good at the right volume. Now, next thing I would do is make sure that if you have programmed in your bass line, that you don't have any sidechain compression bouncing it against the bass. If you're using a sampled loop, as I am in this example, that can be a bit hard because it's kind of programmed in, but there's enough information still going on whilst the kick's actually playing. And that doesn't mean that you're not going to sidechain bounce your bass. It just means that we want to hear that the kick is going to work with those bass frequencies before we've even applied any EQ or any sidechain compression, because it means that the final result is going to be even better. Now, if you have got really extreme sidechain compression kind of baked into your sound, so it looks something more like this, you know, so it's being ducked when the kick's playing. Worst case scenario, you can just copy a part of the bass line and paste it so it is playing at the same place as the kick, like this. But this bass line's okay as it is, so I'm going to just go back to default. Now, this is the most important part. Once all this is set up, we can just hot swap out this kick whilst it's playing in situ with the bass line. So I'm going to turn it down just a little bit more to really let it pop through the mix as we're going. And I'm just going to scroll through a couple of kicks. I'm going to turn off this little preview button here so it doesn't play whenever I roll over a new one. And you can close your eyes for this. Now, when you find one that sounds quite good, just make a note of it on a post-it note, the name of it, and then keep going through your kick folder. Now, the idea is once you've found some that sound good, perhaps 6 or 7 that sound good, then A/B them against each other. So I might think, okay, kick 3 sounds good, kick 1 sounds good, and I might have 2 or 3 others. Then I A/B test them and kill that. And then knock them out by and then cut them out by evaluation until I end up with the strongest one out of all my selections. And as I said, if you spend an extra 10 minutes on this near the beginning of your production, rather than trying to layer together different kicks, the chances are you're going to have a much better result at the end of the day. Now, I want to touch upon another option if you've got something like Splice. Instead of having a kick sample pack, as I have, which I do recommend that you build up over time, let's get rid of that and we're just going to put on Splice Bridge. And what this is going to allow us to do is to synchronize our project to Splice, or rather synchronize Splice to our project. And you could use Loop Cloud as well. That's going to work great for this. And then we can actually preview some of the kick drums from Splice in situ whilst we listen to the bass line. So now we should have Splice synced up nicely. Let's just play this and loop it through. I go to Splice. And you need to make sure that you have this setting here, much like the shaper box, set to 1/4. And now we can just listen to some of the kick drums. Now, one thing I will note is that sometimes there's a little bit of latency here. So if you are using this technique, what you can do is just put -12 or 10 milliseconds. And this is just going to bring Splice forwards a little bit, and it should account for any slight latency that you might be finding. So you can hear that's not the right kind. But as you can see, this can be very time consuming. Hello. That's working really nicely with that bass line. So I'm going to keep that, and then I will just download it from Splice and load it into my project, which takes me to the next stage. Now, it's worth noting, always use reference tracks in your genre as well to try and give your ears some guidance as to the kind of kick you should be having for your track. But most important, as I said, is always testing it against the bass. So at this point, you should have a really fine pairing of kick drum for your bass. Fine selection, sir, or ma'am. And now it's time to season it to taste. I know you don't season wine, so the wine analogy kind of ends here, so okay. But that's fine, let's just leave that now. But the next thing we want to look at is tuning the kick drum. Now, I know deadmau5 ranted about this online. I've seen a couple of other videos online of people saying, oh, you don't need to tune your kick drum, or it's actually bad to tune your kick drum. The truth of the matter, in my opinion and in my experience, is that sometimes it makes the kick work better with the bass line, and sometimes it doesn't. And it takes a couple of minutes to try, so it's always worth trying, guys. So I've loaded in the favorite kick that I listed on my magic list. I'm going to make sure that I turn off that millisecond delay because I've put the drum rack back on and I've got rid of the Splice bridge because I've now chosen my kick. So this is how I test tuning the kick drum to the track. You can look at the fundamental frequency, but I prefer to do it by ear. And if you transpose your kick drum much higher, in frequency, you can start to hear its pitch. So let's have a listen to that. Now, if you know the key of your track, you can do this using a tuner. You don't have to do it by ear. I like to do it by ear, but now I can hear that that kick is actually in tune with the track. But it's obviously way too high. So all you need to do, in Ableton at least, is if you hold Shift and press down on this transpose button, it's going to take it down an octave each time. And now we just need to get it as close to 0 as possible. And that's going to be -2. So now this kick is tuned to the key of the track. And let's have a listen to it. Now, does that sound better or worse than the original? Well, let's transpose it back to the original. I think that kick now gels more nicely with the bass. Now I've tuned it to the key of the track. Now, as I said, that doesn't always happen. In fact, here's an example of where tuning the kick to the track doesn't sound better. So here I've got a house beat and I wanted that classic 909 kick sound because it imparts the vibe I want for this track. But let's try and tune that kick and see how it sounds. So let's take it all the way up. And now let's bring it down as close to 0 as possible. So what's happening here is it's actually killing that interesting transient shape and body that we wanted. So if we compare it to being untuned, it pops through the mix more. And this is tuned. Just flabby and nasty and fighting with the bass. So that's an example of when tuning the kick doesn't work. Okay, so if we rewind a few steps, you'll remember that we set the length of the kick to be half a beat long. This is where we really want to just fine tune that. And again, Shaper Box is fantastic for that because you can actually draw the shape of the kick. So a good rule of thumb is if you make the kick as short as possible whilst it still delivers what it needs to deliver, you're going to have more room in the low end for your bass line and you can end up with a bigger, fatter mix. But of course, it can be easy to shorten your kick too much, so really listen out for your ears. In fact, what you can do is you can make it too short initially and then just feed back in the length of that kick. So let's listen to it when it's this short. It's pretty much just a transient. But now you've lost the low end punch of the kick, right? So let's make it a bit longer. So now we've got the body of the kick into play. That's starting to sound good. Now I actually think this does benefit from a bit of length. So this is where it was. Whoops, let's just get rid of that. And this is where we brought it back to. So you can't hear much difference, but what we've done is we've just shortened the kick by this amount, which means there's going to be more room for that low ends to breathe through. And that's why I say, try and get that kick as short as possible whilst it still delivers the power, because one of the biggest mistakes I see students making is having a kick that's pretty much one whole bar long. And this illustrates why the transient and the body is usually more important than the tail of the kick. So now let's look at processing your kick. Now, it's worth noting that most samples that you get from sample packs have already been processed. They'll already have saturation on them. They'll already have been compressed. So it can be very easy to over-process kicks. And if you've done all of these steps beforehand, the chances are you won't need to process it very much because it's already working well in your track. If there's processing that I tend to reach for first, it's probably going to be a little bit of EQing. Maybe I'll take out some of those boxy frequencies. Basically, again, make it so that the kick works with as few frequencies as possible, because again, you'll have more headroom. So this is just clearing up a little bit of space in these low mids here. And without the bass line, And that's pretty much all I'll do in terms of processing kicks. You might want to add a little bit of saturation and compression if you want, but always A/B test it and make sure it doesn't actually sound worse than before you did the effects, because remember, you're probably going to have processing on that kick drum at the bus level and then again on the master level. So if in doubt, compress less. Now there are actually 7 other ways that you could ruin your low end, and we'll touch upon them in a couple of minutes. But first I want to touch upon a concept called the 10-minute teardown, which is what I teach my students. All it is that when you've finished producing a track, just spend 10 minutes saving out your favorite samples that you've created or used in that track. And one of those, a really big key one, is going to be the kick drum. Now, as I've said, I've shared with you my 10 most used kick drums that I've collected over years and honed down to the ones that I think are the best, but my music isn't the same as yours. So don't be afraid to develop your own favorites folders, and that doesn't just apply to kick drums. It'll help develop your signature sound. It'll also help you start producing more quickly, because then you're only listening to 5 to 10 kick drums each time instead of scrolling through hundreds on Splice. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are also 7 other ways that you could be ruining your low end over and above over-processing your kick. And those mistakes will render everything you've done in terms of kick selection absolutely obsolete. So you can click here to find out what those 7 mistakes are to make sure that you aren't making them in your music. But before you do that, if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and consider subscribing to my channel for music production tips each and every week. Thank you very much, and I will catch you over at this next video.